It's midnight in Fairbanks, Alaska, where Captain Charles Maltby is preparing to take off in a U-2 spy plane. He's heading for the North Pole to take samples of air and atmospheric dust. It's part of the top-secret Project Stardust. What he collects will be analyzed for evidence of Soviet nuclear detonations. His compass does not work near the magnetic North Pole, so he has to navigate with a sextant, leaning like an 18th century sea captain, using only the stars as his guide. But when the vivid pinks and greens of the northern lights brighten the sky, Maltby can no longer see the stars, and his plane strays dangerously off course and towards the Soviet Union.
Saturday, October 27th, will become known as Black Saturday, the tensest point of the crisis, arguably the most dangerous day in human history.
From the BBC World Service, this is The Bomb.
Episode 9, Black Saturday. With me, Nina Khrushcheva.
And me, Max Kennedy.
Cuba, early hours of Saturday. Soviet officers are expecting an attack at daybreak. They work through the night and get no sleep. Nuclear warheads have been brought out of a bunker in the middle of the island and are being transported through the mountains to one of the missile sites.
It's called Sagua Grande in central Cuba. They're brought from their storage depot at a place called Bejucal. It takes about 16 hours for a convoy of trucks together with the warheads to reach Sagua Grande from Bejucal. And at that point, they still have to be mated with the missiles, and that process is going to take about 4 hours. I talked to one of the officers who was responsible for doing that, and he says, yeah, at one point we were 3 or 4 hours away from being able to launch missiles at the United States. That was on Black Saturday, October 27th, 1962.
The American overflights have intensified. The sky seems to be full of Crusader planes crisscrossing the island, flying in pairs over their heads. Castro has given an order to use anti-aircraft guns to fire at low-flying planes. After no sleep, with all the noise, and a tropical storm setting in, it's hard to know whether or not the actual attack has begun.
Orlando, Florida, McCoy Air Force Base. Another U-2 reconnaissance plane is getting ready to take off. The pilot is Major Rudolph Anderson Jr., a veteran of the Korean War. He's 35 years old. Anderson's mission is to photograph Soviet military sites surrounding the American naval base at Guantanamo on the eastern tip of Cuba. He'll be within range of the Soviet air defense tracking system and surface-to-air missiles. As he climbs into the cockpit, Anderson carries in his wallet photographs of his wife Jane and their young children. He takes off at 9:09 a.m. and enters Cuban airspace less than an hour later.
It's noon in Moscow. Khrushchev has again spent a troubled night in his study in the Kremlin. Down the corridor, the Presidium gathers in the wood-paneled conference room. The first point for discussion is an alarming update from General Pliv in Cuba. Pliv says he believes the Americans know where the Soviet nuclear installations are located. If they attack the missile installations as expected, he says he will shoot down their planes. Khrushchev approves this, but he also sends Pliv another urgent cable. It is categorically confirmed that it is forbidden to use nuclear weapons without approval from Moscow. Confirm receipt. Khrushchev believes there is still time for negotiation and that he can get something else out of Kennedy before withdrawing the missiles.
By this point, it was clear that the missiles had become a huge problem, and so Khrushchev was clearly looking for some compensation for withdrawing the missiles. Walter Lippmann, one of the most prominent journalists in the United States, suggests a trade of the U.S. Jupiter medium-range ballistic missiles in Turkey for the Soviet ballistic missiles in Cuba. It's now known that there were members of the ExComm and of the Kennedy administration who had been making the comparison between the two missiles from early on in the crisis, even before Kennedy's speech, and that rumors of this connection had possibly reached the Soviet embassy in Washington and been reported to Moscow.
Khrushchev wonders, could the Walter Lippmann column be a deliberate tactic by Washington to test the water on Turkey? The long letter he sent to Kennedy the day before, pleading with Kennedy to untie the knot of war, talked vaguely about removing military specialists if the United States guaranteed not to invade Cuba. Now he thinks he should come clean about the deployment of Soviet R-12 missiles in Cuba. He will offer to remove them, and in return, on top of the promise not to invade the island, he wants to ask for the elimination of the American Jupiter missile bases in Turkey. Those missiles have been on his mind since the moment in Varna, on the Black Sea, that he decided to set the whole Cuban operation in motion. Khrushchev dictates a new message to Kennedy in the presence of the Presidium. He needs to get it to the White House before Kennedy responds to his previous letter and before any possible attack. So, he sends it to Radio Moscow. It's broadcast at 5 p.m. Moscow time, 10 a.m. in Washington.
The Soviets are sending mixed signals, and there's confusion in the White House. News associations are reporting that Premier Khrushchev has told President Kennedy that he'll withdraw offensive weapons from Cuba, but only if the United States pulls its rockets out of Turkey. President Kennedy is talking with some of the members of the ExComm when he gets the news. They're still digesting Khrushchev's long letter of the previous day, and there's no mention of Turkey in that document. The president quickly realizes that Khrushchev may be putting out another letter. When they finally receive it, the men are stunned.
It's much shorter than the Friday letter, and the Friday letter is much more personal. And so some in Washington believe that the Saturday letter might have been written by committee. And there's even wondering about, has Khrushchev been overthrown? Is he not fully in charge?
It seems like a shift from the night before. My father, Robert Kennedy, has begun the day with alarming news from J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI. Soviet personnel in New York are destroying their documents. That means they think they're on the verge of war. The formal letter from Khrushchev adds to my father's sense of foreboding. But he doesn't think the Turkey demands unreasonable, nor does his brother, the president. The rockets in Turkey are obsolete anyway. He tells his aides that he sees it as a very fair trade, but he struggles to convince any of them.
In Cuba, because of the rain, which is getting worse, General Pliev thinks an attack is getting less likely. Suffering from kidney disease and exhausted by the tension of the previous 24 hours, he needs to sleep and retreats to his bunker. It's 9 a.m. in Havana when radar picks up on an aircraft flying towards the eastern tip of the island. Major Anderson's U-2 plane has been spotted. If his pictures get back to Washington and show that the missile sites are ready to be paired with nuclear warheads, the power of the Soviet nuclear threat from Cuba will be exposed. The Soviets are primed to attack aircraft flying over Cuba. Their surface-to-air missiles are ready to fire, but they need permission from General Pliev to shoot down the plane. The general only has approval from Khrushchev to fire at planes in self-defense. A phone call to Pliev is answered by General Grechko, his duty officer. Grechko doesn't know what to do. He discusses it with his colleague at the headquarters, General Garbuz.
And those generals, again, that's the generation that went through World War II, they believed that if their positions were uncovered by the aircraft, immediately after that would come either bombers or, in the conditions of 1962, missiles.
Without the knowledge of Pliev or Khrushchev, the order to fire at the U-2 is given at 10:19 a.m. Havana time. It's 11:19 in Washington and 8:19 p.m. in Moscow.
President Kennedy wants to accept Khrushchev's proposal, but the rest of the ex-com tells him it would look like a betrayal to take the American missiles out of Turkey, as though the United States was deserting Europe and NATO. At a separate meeting in a top-secret Pentagon conference room, the United States Air Force Chief General Curtis LeMay has been busy getting a proposal ready for the president. He wants to launch a massive airstrike the next morning, Sunday, followed by an immediate invasion of Cuba with ground troops to finish the job. The Strategic Air Command is ready to fight a nuclear war at a moment's notice. They keep nuclear-armed B-52 bombers in the air every minute of every day, just in case. And naval forces are already surrounding Cuba.
What the Americans don't realize is that the Cubans, or rather their Soviet patrons, have tactical nuclear weapons targeted on those beaches, so that if the Americans had landed, they would have been probably wiped out by a tactical nuclear weapon, which would have killed thousands and thousands of Americans.
Robert McNamara, the American Defense Secretary, joins the Pentagon meeting at 1:30 p.m. Soon after, the chief of the Joint Reconnaissance Group walks in with some bad news. A U-2 has strayed over Soviet territory in the Arctic. This is Maltby's U-2, the one taking air samples at the North Pole. McNamara is tired. He's been eating and sleeping in his office for several days, and only been home once for dinner. He was known for his extraordinary emotional control, but at that moment he shouts across the table, "This means war with the Soviet Union." For Khrushchev, a reconnaissance mission crossing into the Soviet Union at this stage could be seen as the final prelude to an American attack, a last-minute preparation before nuclear war.
Out in the Sargasso Sea, northeast of Cuba, 4 nuclear-armed Soviet submarines are being tracked by the U.S. Navy in the area of the blockade line. In command of all 4 submarines is Captain Vasily Arkhipov. He is aboard one of them, named B-59. A year earlier, he was deputy commander of a nuclear submarine when its reactor exploded, killing many of the crew.
Vasily Arkhipov, he is very young. He is 36 years old. He was on that submarine, so he faced a situation of a nuclear fire. And he showed himself to be very cold-blooded. In fact, he did not panic at all. He was professional, cold, reasonable, and very brave.
Arkhipov's B-59 is armed with torpedoes. One of them is tipped with a nuclear warhead, which is 2/3 of the power of the Hiroshima bomb. He has questioned his superiors on when it should be used. He has not been given an answer. Also on board is Captain Valentin Savitsky. They are of equal rank.
They're supposed to patrol in the Sargasso Sea until further orders. And this is where the U.S. anti-submarine warfare forces start following them, trying to surface them.
Back in 2001, Svetlana began interviewing all of the surviving captains of the 4 submarines. There were different accounts of what happened on board the B-59 that day. Over the years, she managed to piece together a story which she says had been a deeply held secret.
They're trying to evade the pursuit by the U.S. forces, so they go up, they go down, they try to recharge the batteries. So people on the boat are in really stressful conditions. The temperature throughout the boat is 40 Celsius. And in the engine room, it went up to 60 Celsius. So people are fainting like flies.
On the surface, the USS Coney is one of the American naval ships that have detected the submarines. It's chasing the B-59. In the late afternoon, the Coney drops dummy depth charges to try to get the B-59 to surface and identify itself to the U.S. Navy.
Savitsky, the commander of B-59, never had an experience of hearing anti-submarine forces use depth charges. It's like sitting in a metal barrel when somebody bangs on that barrel. This is the diary of Captain 3rd Rank Anatoly Andreev. He was on B-59. He describes Savitsky. The commander's nerves are shot to hell. He's yelling at everyone and torturing himself. He's already becoming paranoid, scared of his own shadow.
In Washington, D.C., good news comes in about Maltby's U-2, lost in Soviet airspace, that has caused so much alarm. Soviet fighter jets have attempted to intercept his plane, but Maltby has managed to avoid them. He found his way to a frozen airstrip and deployed a parachute to slow his fuselage like a drag racer. He is shaken, but safe and sound on icy American soil. Then, at 4:50 p.m., more news comes in. Rudolf Anderson's U-2, taking photos over Cuba, has not reported in. An hour later, the Americans learn why. He's been shot down by a Soviet missile over Cuba. My father, Robert Kennedy, asks whether the pilot has been killed. General Maxwell Taylor replies with a grim explanation. The pilot's body is in the plane.
And this is a crucial moment because someone in the XCOM meeting, the voice is not entirely clear who it was, says they fired the first shot, meaning maybe the Soviets have decided to move towards force to defend their position. Maybe this is the beginning of a war.
My father would later write in his memoir, 13 Days, there was the feeling that the noose was tightening on all of us, on Americans, on mankind, and that the bridges to escape were crumbling.
Kennedy makes a crucial decision. There had been a contingency plan that if a U-2 was shot down over Cuba, the response would be to attack the base in Cuba that fired the SAM surface-to-air missile that downed the U-2. But Kennedy rejects this because he says the situation is too sensitive. And so the U.S. does not immediately retaliate.
So he's in some ways increasingly isolated. He is determined by this point to convince the Kremlin that he is sincere, that a trade, the Soviet missiles in Cuba for the American missiles in Turkey, we're going to have that trade.
There comes a point in this crisis when it feels as if, in spite of the difficulty in communication, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev are aligned more closely to each other than with the people around them. When Nina and I met, one of the things we wanted to talk about was whether the two men felt an actual personal connection after their summit meeting in Vienna. We both hit on a seemingly minor comment, the poignant moment when Nikita Khrushchev realizes that his son, Leonid, who had been killed in the Second World War, would now be the same age as John F. Kennedy. It makes me think back to Vienna and how everyone says that that was such a disaster, but it did give them a chance to meet personally. And I think that President Kennedy left an impression on Khrushchev, which was really important, which was that he was a veteran. He was the same age as Khrushchev's son, and he was in a position that Khrushchev's son might have occupied in Russia if he had survived. And I think, is it possible that that stayed with him and he began to think of President Kennedy in much more friendly terms, even though they were in conflict with each other. He began to see the pressures that President Kennedy was under and the fact that both of them were really seeking peace.
Yes, Max, many people, including Pierre Salinger, Kennedy's press secretary, said no, this was the moment. Actually, he was the first one I heard it from. That was the moment when they understood that they have something in common, and that Khrushchev was looking at President Kennedy and thinking, my son could have been like that. It was a connection, not just the war, but also what Kennedy represented that Leonid could have.
I mean, they had at least a glimpse of the humanity in each other. And I've got to think that some part of that came back to both men, and they probably both thought, we can work this out.
After hours of trying to avoid depth charges, conditions on the B-59 submarine in the Sargasso Sea are becoming unbearable. The sub has to come to the surface to start its diesel engines and recharge its batteries. The conning tower, a raised platform, is the first part of the submarine above the water. Savitsky, then Arkhipov, and the signaling officer come up first. But the signaling officer gets his equipment caught in the staircase. What they see as they come up for air is a shock.
They've been sitting below the surface with almost no electricity, almost in the dark. When the submarine surfaces, Savitsky, who is the first person on the conning tower, looks around and he sees a group of American destroyers and aircraft carrier. The helicopters and the planes are trying to take pictures of the submarine, and they're pointing these very, very bright lights on the conning tower. So looking at that and not having information for the last almost 2 days, Savitsky thinks they're under attack.
Savitsky panics. He tries to descend from the bridge back below. He wants to give the order to fire the nuclear torpedo.
So he immediately turns around and runs down to the staircase. He tries to get down and he yells down, "Urgent dive, arm torpedo number 1." He can't get down immediately because the signaling officer is still trying to come up. Meanwhile, Arkhipov is standing on the conning tower, looking around and trying to figure out if the war has already started, if they're under attack.
Arkhipov notices a flashing light coming from the USS Coney. Gary Slaughter, on board the Coney, is signaling an apology to the Soviets for the aggressive behavior of one of the overhead planes. The Americans are not attacking them.
And he turns to Savitsky and he calms him down. He says, "We're not under attack. They're trying to communicate with us."
It comes down to chance and split-second decisions. If the Soviet captains had fired, political shockwaves would have meant U.S. retaliation against the Soviet Union. The Americans won't be aware of this near miss for almost 40 years.
As day turns into night in Washington, nerves are fraying in the White House. People are losing focus. They're going around in circles. Rival factions draft different responses to Khrushchev. Some in the cabinet room want to ignore the issue of the Turkey missiles. They think that if the United States offers to negotiate, Khrushchev will demand an endless list of concessions. It becomes my father's job to push everyone into moving forward, quickly. More and more conversations begin to happen outside the cabinet room, away from the tension in XCOM. At 7:30 p.m., President Kennedy makes his position clear. Why would this committee want to do something as dangerous as invading when the United States can safely trade away the Soviet missiles in Cuba for the obsolete Jupiter missiles in Turkey? My father and Ted Sorensen draw up a letter which incorporates several of the rival proposals. In it, they call for work on the Cuban missile sites to cease and request that the weapons be made inoperable. Then the United States will lift the naval quarantine, and there will be no attack on Cuba. This letter makes no mention of the missile swap. The president approves it because he has another plan: for Robert Kennedy to negotiate that swap in secret.